Here's a piece for you. And a piece for you.
Say Kong, sir.
Who cares? They're hungry.
God damn it, Corsi. I send you out to map the fucking jungle trails. You come back with a bunch of sick-looking dinks. What the hell am I supposed to do with them?
Say Kong.
They're refugees.
Ah.
Say goddamn lie. Say Kong family.
No, they're not.
What is it, Sergeant? Who are these people?
Corsi dragged them out of the pucker bush. Cowboy, give them rice and run them off.
Now, just a moment. Now, your attitude is wrong, Sergeant. It is part of our job here to win the hearts and minds of the people.
Sir.
We will make them welcome.
Sir, you don't understand.
Understand my duty, Sergeant. Corporal Lincoln, take these natives to the hospital and give them a health check. Corporal Corsi, I'll make you responsible for seeing they have food and shelter.
Okay, so we now come to this third section, which is about the Americans and the way the Americans are going to fight this war. And again, the film is extremely helpful in sort of showing the things that I've been talking about. It's just a lot easier to see it. You're like, oh, that actually makes sense, instead of hearing about it. You're like, oh, what the heck is that? It's abstract. So the first clip that we just looked at shows the interaction between the Vietnamese refugees who have presumably been burned out. That is, their village has been burned. It's not clear. And Corsi picks them up. And then there's a fight between basically the old hands and the new hands. And the old hands say, Cowboy says, okay, they're Viet Cong, so we got to get rid of them. And Ulyanovsky, who is experienced but has become suicidal and can't stand the war anymore, but he's been forced back into the field because they needed every person. This is the draft. I'm trying to remember if the draft had even started. In '64, there's no draft yet. But they're using all the hands they can get. So they're forcing old people like Ulyanovsky, who would have been at this point just about to retire, back into the field, and that kills him because he can't take it. He can't take the anxiety and the stress. So he's like, no, we're not playing this game. Give them some rice and run them off. But then Lieutenant Hamilton, Corsi, says, no, we have to do the right thing. They're hungry. These are Viet Cong, or these are South Vietnamese. We don't know if they're the enemy. It doesn't matter. We're going to, this is basically effectively, this is sort of the Army as a kind of Peace Corps initiative. And this was part of Kennedy's mission, because it's '64, so Kennedy has been killed. But Corsi would have been the kind of person who would have been a believer in Kennedy. Probably voted Democrat. Probably for the first time that he was allowed to vote, that he was old enough to vote, and would have believed in Kennedy's when Kennedy established the Peace Corps, and basically that the way that you go into other countries is that you go there to do good, basically. So your job is to dig wells and provide medical service and not kill people is the point. And so that's Corsi's idealism. And then the fight is between these two sides. So Ulyanovsky, who was like, forget it, we're not dealing with this. And Cowboy, who was like, convinced, he knows they're Viet Cong, and he's identified them. He just knows. And this always happens in a Western, basically, where against the advice of the old guard, the new guard says, no, things are going to be different, and they bring in the enemy inside the walls, and there's going to be trouble, and there is. And Hamilton, Lieutenant Hamilton, who was the young, fresh, green lieutenant, who isn't as bright as Corsi, comes along and says, this is my duty to Ulyanovsky, the sergeant, the experienced sergeant, and says, we're here to win the hearts and minds of these people. And that is exactly, of course, the notion, right? The hearts, as I talked about in the history lectures, the winning of hearts and minds was supposed to be the new way of pursuing this guerrilla war. But at the same time, and this will come up in Hare, in Dispatches, and in Apocalypse Now, and so on, you can't win the hearts and minds of a people if you're also killing them. It's like you can't do it. It's not gonna work. If you're going to get into an insurgency or a guerrilla operation, it becomes an anthropological issue. Now, people will say, about war. The war is sort of one of the most fundamental anthropological endeavors, basically, that it is the meeting of two tribes where one tribe is determined to culturally prevail, to use one of Trump's favorite words. It's actually been around for a long time as in this sort of way. And it's a kind of a World War II, post-World War II sort of strategic term. We shall prevail. And that's what the reference is to here. So there's a lot going on in this little tiny package of film. Okay.
What's Bujam doing in the red? Mungtao ought to be in the red.
No, sir. Mungtao is definitely declining in incident ratio. My flowchart indicates that the next concentrated offensive will be against Bujam.
There hasn't been a shot fired in Bujam in 3 months.
Sir, if you wish me to explain the incremental digital contingencies and the compatible logistical projections by which the flowchart has arrived at red for Bujam...
Forget it. It's got the toughest fortifications of any of the outposts, and Charlie knows it.
World War II.
What?
That's what I call a major. World War II.
Precisely.
Okay, so in this clip we just looked at, Barker and the new lieutenant who is from psychological operations, they deliberately don't. I tried to remember whether this guy was from the CIA, because I was like, it seems like he's CIA, but he's not. He's not military intelligence either. He's not, which is sort of one of the. There was always a joke about that. It's like, oh, military intelligence, haha, what a contradiction in terms, which is fair enough. Any corporate intelligence, really, that's corporate intelligence. How intelligent is that? But he's not, and he's so he says it's psychological warfare. Could be army, he's dressed in army greens. Anyway, so I think they deliberately have left that open. He is from one of the many arms of the military working on basically how to handle information, and whether you're involved in propaganda or whether you're involved in trying to figure out exactly what Charlie is doing. In this case, he comes in with his incident flow rate priority indicator, which is just so great. I mean, it's just a completely meaningless bunch of language together, where presumably there's, you're trying to track the incidents and the amount of incidents that happen and so on. And this, I mentioned, is the rise of operations research and statistics that is brought to bear on the Vietnam War. So if you remember, I showed you pictures of, big rooms full of computers with tape drives and these big disk drives, and people sitting at, early consoles and things like that. That is where this guy comes from. He comes from that world of using information to analyzing information to figure out what is going to happen. And when we see him standing at the table, it's very interesting. He's got a slide rule in his hand, which is of course perfect. So this is the pre-electronic calculator, and it took quite a lot of skill to actually use a slide rule. You had to learn how to use it. People took courses in the slide rule, and it was a very complex calculator that could do log scales and things like that. As I say, but you had to learn to do it. So when electronic calculators became available, and then they could do graphing calculators and things like that. It was a huge deal. I mean, people stopped having to learn as much math. So this is why there's always been an argument about the de-skilling of. People who learn math now, they may be good at math, but they don't know math the way people who learn a slide rule have to learn it, because they will have learned more math skills, is the argument, as opposed to the person who's learned on a calculator. So this guy's got, the slide rule. He's got the French curve. So he's got a little flowchart grid that is a little stencil that allows him to make flowchart boxes and draw them out and so on. So he's got all the ironically analog tools that you have to use when you're writing a digital program, because at the time writing digital programs was slow and long, and so you did a lot of planning before you wrote. That's this guy, and he's bringing on computing, and this is the beginning of the postmodern war. So there's a collision between these two forces. The young lieutenant, who will be probably, my guess is that he'll probably be a colonel at the end of the war. This is a guy they're called, what did they call them? Desktop warriors, something like that. Yeah, I can't remember. They had, in the Air Force they used to say, oh, they're making me fly a desk. In other words, they put you on desk duty and they don't let you go into the field. But this guy's job is never to be in the field. His job is to analyze the information that's coming in and to figure out where things are going to appear. So his job is to tell, because Barker says, we don't have any information. Charlie has all the information. We don't have any. It's like, well, that's going to change, is the argument. Of course, that didn't work. What works is really getting out into the field and talking to people and figuring out what it is they need. And if you can help them, then and you show them you're loyal and you'll protect them and so on, then they'll begin to help you in exchange if they see that it makes sense to them and so on. So there's a whole lot of complex stuff that's going on. And then Toffee was this. It's unusual to have an African American on a desk, which is interesting, especially at this time in the military. And Barker's attitude toward him is good. I mean, Barker's basically he's a good white man. Basically, this is sort of like he's not racist. He's not he's sexist. He's not racist. And he's not he's another decent American. This is the point, and this is why the relationship between Barker and Corsi is so important, because basically it's sort of a father-son relationship where he's mentoring the young man into becoming the next generation of soldiers. But of course, it looks as though Corsi won't stay as a soldier. He wants to go home. He's had it. Forget this, forget the mission. So what happens is anybody's guess to Corsi. But so Barker is in direct collision, and that Toffee says World War II. That's what I call him about the Major, because the Major is working with what he's learned in World War II and what he's learned in Korea. And this young guy is bringing in techniques that come from operations research, which is happening in Washington and at the Pentagon. So it's cutting edge technology, and it's kind of like having somebody show up in a village that has had the telegraph with a smartphone and say, check this out, and they're like, what is that? It's completely, just doesn't make any sense. You don't have any of the requisite literacies that you need to understand technologically what is this going to do. So, and Barker is right, of course, to be cautious about it. He's like, well, if it works, fantastic. But of course, it's not going to work, and he's dubious. And the guy sort of sounds like a clown. If you wish me to explain the digital contingencies, okay, okay, shut up.